Good afternoon. We're going to get started here. I'm Mark Obie from the Newhouse School. This is the Law, Politics, and Media Speaker Series. It's both a class and a public lecture. The students in the class, we ask that you put out your name cards so that our guest knows who you are when she calls on you if you're during the Q&A. And I'll pass around the sign-up sheet for our students as well. After our guest makes a presentation, goes through a talk that she has prepared, we'll have an ample period for Q&A with her, and then a reception starting about 5 o'clock out in the hall with the usual treats. I want to recap a little bit about what some of the previous speakers in the series have said as it relates to what we're going to talk about today, or what I think we're going to talk about today. We had a former elected judge who perceived the media as pretty much a platform for paid commercials. I'm going to distill and maybe put a little bit of spin here, but I'm not trying to spin. I just can't help it. Saw the media really as a tool to be used, but he wasn't really engaged with the idea of journalists covering him. He had to buy time. We had a critic of judicial elections who lamented journalists' apathy in covering the courts, and you sort of got the feeling from him that he saw journalists as really sort of checked out from the public function that they should serve in covering the courts. We had a media defense lawyer, somebody who's devoted his career to helping journalists get out of trouble, who worried that misbehavior and self-interest in the pursuit of ratings and money by the media had undercut journalists' standing in court when they got into trouble. They didn't have the credibility with judges that they ought to have. We had a practicing lawyer who's an on-air commentator on TV who's critical of practicing lawyers or on-camera commentators of legal issues, and who distinguished between describing what's going on in a legal proceeding and then simply hyping opinions about that. We had recently a public relations executive who commends reporters for trying to get the facts right, but he isn't shy about his strategy, which is to use reporters to further his ends, to use the publicity to improve his clients' reputations and to help them win their cases through news coverage. And finally, we had earlier in the semester a former reporter who told of the hard work of in-depth reporting on a big trial, but she also admitted that she was very glad that she had exited the business before new media had made it a 24/7 business. She had one deadline and one deadline only, and she is glad that she's retired. Today's speaker brings a perspective to these issues from an award-winning reporting career spanning more than 30 years. I had the privilege of working with and learning from Mary Flood on the criminal courts beat at the Houston Post back in the mid-'80s. That's the 1980s, just to be clear. I'm making fun of myself, not you. I have one war story that I want to relate that illustrates, I think, Mary's passion for the job. Beat reporters make the rounds at a courthouse. They go from courtroom to courtroom talking to, you hope, the judges, but at least the assistant DAs, to find out what's going on, and the clerks, to find out whether there's any news in each of the courts. Houston's a big city, so it has lots of criminal courts. I was making the rounds one morning. We shared that responsibility, but I had it that day. And I walked into one of the courtrooms. I walked into all of them, but in one in particular, I walked in and I said to the assistant DA, "So, anything good going on?" And he said, "Nope." And I moved on. Didn't make a lot of small talk. Just kept moving. And the next day, our competition, the Houston Chronicle, had an amazing front page story from that court. Blew me out of the water. I had the usual reporter revulsion at being scooped. Showed up for work, and my senior colleague had words to say about how could I have been scooped this badly. And I told her about the conversation with the ADA, and I told her that I had called him and said, how could I have gotten, what happened? Why didn't you tell me about this? And he said, well, you asked anything good going on, and this was bad. And so I told her that, and I also told her that I hadn't schmoozed him enough. I had just sort of come in, tried to get from him what I wanted, and then walked out without treating him like a human being. And so I was trying to cover for him a little bit, but she stood up, stormed out of the press room, and I never actually heard the details of that conversation with that M are the initials. You'll remember. I never heard the details of the conversation with that prosecutor, between Mary and that prosecutor, but from then on, he was the most obsequious, helpful assistant DA in all of Harris County, Texas, because Mary Flood has that kind of influence and that kind of, I don't want to say power, because it's not as if she was lording it over them, but she made it clear that we reporters had a job to do, and they had a job, public officials had a job to do in giving us the information that we needed. The Houston Post is no longer, and not our fault, but it is no longer with us. But Mary Flood has taken a circuitous route to get to her current position at the Houston Chronicle, where she now covers federal courts, and in the past has covered business and the Enron case and investigative reporting and criminal courts. After the Houston Post, Mary decided to get a law degree because she'd seen lawyers doing this stuff and thought, I can do that. So she graduated cum laude from the Harvard Law School and went on to work at Morrison & Forster in Washington and at a personal injury firm in Houston, practicing law for 3 years in those two cities. Eventually, though, decided that journalism was her first love after all, and went back to work as a working reporter, first at the Wall Street Journal, and then to our old competitor, the Houston Chronicle, 9 years ago. And I'm very pleased to have my old friend here to tell you about the work of a legal reporter in the age of new media. Please welcome Mary Flood.
Thank you, Rita. It's my pleasure to be here. As I'm sure you've had people tell you before, Mark Obie is one of the most caring and hardworking and knowledgeable people in this field, and I'm pleased to be invited by him and to have apparently yelled at somebody on his behalf. I don't remember that, but is that guy's last name? Do they make faucets?
Yes.
Yeah, oh, that guy. Okay. Okay, so a lot of you are law students, I understand, so I'm starting with my one journalist joke. As you know, there are thousands and millions of lawyer jokes, but I actually only know one journalist joke, and it's this. So a photojournalist is at the scene of a raging river. It's a flood, and the leader of the free world stops by, President now Obama. I told it with Bush, it worked better, a lot better actually, because the president falls into the river. So yeah, it was. Let's pretend it's still Bush. It's Bush, and he falls into the river. And the question is, this photojournalist, what he's got to go through is decide whether he saves the leader of the free world or whether he gets a potentially great Pulitzer Prize-winning photo. And for extra credit, you just have to tell me whether he used a flash or not. Get it? Come on. Okay, so I'm here mostly to talk about the internet and what it has done to my job and what it's doing to my job. There's a lot that's good and a lot that's bad. I mean, I think there's a yin-yang to a lot of what's going on with the internet and newspapers, but there's also this, like, really, really desperately awful part of what's going on with the internet and newspapers, and that's the part that's kind of the death spiral of newspapers, the part I really hate. There's great and there's awful. And for that photojournalist who, maybe took the photo instead of pulled him out of the river, his work is harder than it's ever been. For every reporter at newspapers, every reporter at local TV stations, the work is harder than it's ever been. We're doing the work of many people, many different jobs. And also, we could be out of jobs pretty soon. I guess it's 3 weeks ago now, I saw 80 of my colleagues walked out the door. When I say walked out the door, a security guard walked them out the door. And last week at the Dallas Morning News, 50 people in the newsroom were walked out the door. And it's happening, newspapers all over the country, every week, and has been for some time. It's not just the economy, of course. The economy is just exacerbating what's going on. And the internet has a great deal to do with that. So the positive side of what's going on with the internet is our news coverage is deeper. We can give you so much more. We don't just cover the trial. We can give you the transparency of you being able to see the indictment, see the motions, see the orders, read the briefs. I'm not sure many people do it, but we put it up there. Some do. We give you expanded coverage. I've covered the Roger Clemens case, too, and there's just a mass of information that we give you when somebody's suspected of using steroids. There's the transparency of you being able to look at the documents yourself. There is what appears to be many more voices, and I would tell you that I think that's an appearance and not a reality. I'll talk about that a little bit more too. And there's, of course, reader input. Wow, how much fun is that? The bad side, we're unsure that we can support ourselves doing this. We also tend to be covering more and more, for lack of a better word, moronic things. On our website and on many websites, you are going to see dogs, cats, breasts, and celebrities a lot. And we're newspapers. But now we're newspapers online, and we're dealing with a lot more people, and we're dealing with a lot more interests. I call it expanded coverage of the inane. Basically, I think that what the internet has done is more Brittany. How do you spell that? I don't know, spelling. And eventually, I think what we'll have is less democracy. I'll explain what I mean by that. I think this is actually a very serious problem. So more voices. The only problem is I think there's sort of a derivative drivel involved in all these voices that you hear. Some of you actually were there at lunch. I can't believe you want to hear me again. And I think likely the end of many newspapers, which is why I think there's going to be a problem with democracy, because I know that newspapers are the engine of how we check on our democracy, how we check on our government. Especially, the thing is, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal will probably still exist. But there's going to be a point where there may not be a Houston Chronicle and a Boston Globe and a Miami Herald and a Cleveland Plain Dealer. There already isn't a Seattle Post-Intelligencer, and there already isn't a Rocky Mountain Morning News. And the Detroit papers aren't printing on the first few days of the week. And I understand the Post-Standard changed today. And whatever change it was, I bet it's smaller. So it's likely the end of us. And with the end of us, you get the end of the largest news-gathering machine that we've had in our country. And it's really important for a lot of reasons. This is a really complicated relationship, basically, between the internet, for the internet and us in the news media, we in the news media. Sarah Kellogg, writing for the Washington Lawyer, said this about legal journalism. I really liked it. She said, the internet is both the slayer and the savior of legal journalism. That's the yin and the yang, the slayer and the savior. I thought that was exactly right. She was talking about, obviously I can see you with my glasses up and I can see what down here with them down. It's brilliant. That fewer newspapers, she was lamenting that fewer newspapers have court reporters. They can't afford them anymore. We can't afford a lot. Think about a newsroom that loses 80 people. That's about 28%. And we're the fourth largest city in the country, Houston is. And we just lost 28% of the people that we have to cover those courthouses and city councils and county governments and school districts. So who's going to be there? Nobody else is going to be there. That's the problem. So she was talking about fewer newspapers being able to pay for court reporters. And the good side, she said, is more law firms are online, more lawyers are blogging, more courts are online, and more litigants. And I'll talk about that a little more later, too, because I've covered some trials where the litigants have gone online. So as the internet changes news gathering, there's something I really want your generation to understand and to do, and that is to somehow fund news gathering another way. At lunch, there was somebody who said, Ms. Flood, you just don't understand. Our generation, we just want it online. We just want it short bits. We can read WSJ, the blogs, and we're fine. That's all we want. And that's sort of like telling me, Ms. Flood, we only want the view from the penthouse, and we really don't need those 10 floors below it. Guess what? It's not a penthouse without the 10 floors below it. If someone asks you, where does news come from, don't tell them a stork delivers it to the internet, okay? That was anyway. So basically, you got to have somebody giving you the information that you then can get in the little bits that you want to read. I don't care how you guys get your news, and whether you get it on Twitter, whether you get it on a blog, whether you get it online, or whether you get it on a newspaper. I just want it to have a quality that actually questions what goes on in your courts, keeps them open, questions what goes on in your city council. And the concern is especially for the cities and the counties and for the places that don't have the biggest newspapers in the country. So then on PBS Frontline series about the news, they had this figure from, I guess it was an LA Times editor who said that and I think he's right, about 85% of the news that you read on the internet or see on the cables comes from originally from newspapers. Newspapers are the seed of the news. That's where news comes from as opposed to historic. They come from newspapers, most of the news that you read, and then it's bounced around. I remember being really pleased once when I woke up in the morning and I heard my exact words from a story being read on NPR, on the local NPR affiliate, and thinking, wow, those are my words. I didn't think, which I should have, wow, they stole my words. But I was, there's hubris, and I was pleased to be quoted, sort of, though I wasn't quoted. I was just stolen. So basically, you think you're hearing a choir of voices, when in fact you're hearing an echo. And I really want you to understand that, especially when so much of what you hear is opinion, or opinion based on opinion, or somebody saying what's going to happen next. That's not the news. They're all speculating on the news and talking about the news, but it's not the same as the news. So when I'm talking about journalists, and newspapers, isn't that great when I make a little noise at the end? Journalists and newspapers and reporters, I want you to understand what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about Rush Limbaugh, and I'm not talking about Keith Olbermann, I'm not talking about Nancy Grace. I'm talking about people who sit through a 404B hearing. And I'm talking about people who get freedom of information requests and fight for them for a long time. People who sit outside of grand juries. I did that for a couple of years on Enron. People who are following a trial like I did recently and did a bunch of open records requests and got stuff that they didn't even get in discovery. Reporting is sometimes boring and tedious. If we wanted to compare reporting to in the legal world, reporting is due diligence, and it's depositions, and it's discovery. And the stuff that you see on TV and the stuff you might read in blogs is practice for moot court. They aren't the same thing. And the thing you got to protect, I think, is the discovery and the due diligence. Reporting also involves, of course, getting the statistics before you run anything. Every morning, the first thing I do, I literally get up, get on the computer, and go to Pacer and read through the indictments of the people who are going to have hearings that day in federal court. It's not when Mark covered federal court, that wasn't what he was able to do. So obviously the internet has changed my reporting a great deal because I get to do that. But I'm actually doing it. I'm not just waiting until the Department of Justice puts out a 4-paragraph press release to put something out. That's real reporting, finding out what's going on, finding out what might be interesting. The Department of Justice is going to only send out stuff that they win, basically. So you have to look at everything. It's long and it's hard and it's tedious and it's so incredibly important to what we do in this country, not just in this practice here. So the internet, the good stuff from the internet. I want to talk to you a little bit about covering trials with the internet versus the way it used to be. I mean, it used to be, when I started in this business, I wrote one story, and I wrote it at the end of the day, usually, and it was in the paper the next day. And that was so easy compared to what I do now. So, on a big story like Enron, or, of course, in Houston, we have hurricanes, Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Rita, Hurricane Roger Clemens and steroids. We have a lot of this stuff. We have, the stuff that we put up includes, well, one good thing about it is immediacy. Something happens, like Jeff Skilling's appeal comes out from the Fifth Circuit. We have that up in about 10 minutes, even if it's 200 pages. Because for one, we know it's coming, so we have 3 versions prepared. For 2, I can read it or somebody else who knows what's going on, and we can tell, if it says affirmed or if it says reversed for whatever. And for 3, we need to put it up in 10 minutes because otherwise somebody else will. So there's a great deal of competition on something really huge. There's not a great deal of competition on the things that we don't know about, of course, or the things that are smaller city council type things. Another thing the internet has done is allowed us to put up the legal documents like I mentioned, allowed us to have podcasts. In Enron we had several where I was sort of the MC and we had lawyers from both sides or a columnist or somebody talking about some of the biggest events. It's basically a radio show. We also had legal definitions up. We had a Q&A where people could write into me. It was called brilliantly. My editor named it Ask Mary. Wow. We had reader forums where people could just go on and on. whatever they want. We had video, we had live chats. It's a lot. It's a lot more than that one story. It's a lot to do, too. So we can give people, in a big trial, what they need to know, and we can give them now what they want to know. And that is often a much lower denominator, I'll tell you. There's information, there's entertainment, and I think what the internet has done in part is made us both, all the time, 24/7. By the way, people used to say, when's your deadline? And they thought it made them sound sophisticated. If someone asks me when my deadline is now, it sounds very unsophisticated to me because my deadline is now. And now it's now. You know, it's always now because of the internet. So, during the Enron trial, the last one, the one with Ken Lay, who of course died afterwards, and or shortly after, and Jeff Skilling, who's in prison now, my average day covering that trial, my average day covering another trial was getting there at 9 and going home at 6. My average day in the Enron trial, about 5 a.m., I would get up and start answering email because some people who were interested, some people who were knowledgeable, some people who were just apparently very lonely would email me a lot during the trial. So at 5 a.m. I got up and I answered the email. By 7 a.m. I was at the courthouse when the door opened so that I could get my place in court. I had a little pillow and a little laminated thing that said the Houston Chronicle that basically meant I'll beat you up if you sit here. And I put that down. And then after I got my pillow placed, and we had three of us, the AP reporter, the Washington Post reporter, and me, and we would sometimes let the other one go get coffee, and we'd place their pillow. But we were the only three that trusted each other. Anyway, you build coalitions like that, the Pillow Coalition. 7 a.m., okay, the cushion's down. Then I went to my office, and I would either start writing for the blog, and sometimes there was actually something already to write, or I might do a radio interview. I did a lot of NPR and Marketplace during that. And then it was court blog lunch, court blog. At the end of the day, I had to go down and do a TV analysis for one of our local affiliates. We'd made this, my boss had made a deal with a CBS affiliate, so I went on every night and explained what had happened. And then, we're talking about 6:30 or 7, I would go and write the one story, which used to be all I used to do. And that one story was so different because it was informed by all the things I wrote in the blog. It had to be more analysis, more second day, because everybody already knew everything that had happened because you're getting information all day and from so many sources. In anything high profile, it winds up being like this now. Not just trials. For Hurricane Katrina, which took down the big tree at my house. Hurricane Rita took down the little tree at my house. For Katrina, I had to drive to work a couple times during the curfew. And as soon as I got to work, I'd write on the blog what it was like to drive on the curfew. In Katrina, we were all the news all the time because all of our homes were out of electricity. We were all out there. In Rita, not so much, because it really hit away from us. It still took my tree. I thought that was so rude because it really hit Beaumont. But when my tree went down, I wrote on our blog that in the middle of the night at 2 o'clock, I heard this, deafening crash, and I looked out, and I think I wrote, I saw my tree in an unusual yoga position. And then, like 3 weeks later, somebody says, look at this. Some Scottish newspaper had picked up what I wrote on the blog. This just shows you everything goes forever. The Scottish newspaper said, and Mary Flood was, this is actually, I'm still mad about this. Mary Flood was hiding in her home when she heard this. I was laying in my bed, like right next to a window, okay? I was not hiding. If any of you know anybody in Scotland, please let them know. Anyway, the stuff goes on forever. And the live blogs, I don't know if ours were the first. When we started it, then the Washington Post came about a week later, and the Wall Street Journal, too, doing live blogs from the Enron case. Since then, it's been done at Scooter Libby. It was done at the Beltway Sniper. It was done, let's see, the Holy Land for Relief and Development in Dallas. It's been done in much smaller places. Cedar Rapids had somebody who did one recently. And in several of those cases, despite the fact that they were after several other people had blogged, some of them say they're the first people to ever blog. It's kind of interesting. But anyway, and it doesn't have to be a trial to have changed the way we do things. The Roger Clements stuff that I've covered, which could involve a trial eventually, I'm afraid, for Roger, If you go to our website, you see the 60 Minutes interview. You see his stats. You see an explanation of what HGH is, what steroids are, stuff about Barry Bonds, some of the interviews that he did. I've had to do 3 or 4 live chats. That's another thing that's changed with the interview, where at noon we get online and people write in questions to us, and I just immediately respond. And most of the questions that I'm asked, because I go on as a lawyer who's writing about sports, most of them are that, but sometimes they ask, what do you think about his arm? And I have to, ask some of the sports guys, what do I think about his arm? It looked very big to me, actually. I interviewed him, and it looked very big. That was about it. He seemed kind of mad, too. So anyway, there are 2 kinds of big trials. I call them there's the Prurient Circus. That's the Michael Jackson, Kobe Bryant. And then sort of the business/importance circus trial, which is like Enron, Martha Stewart, Scooter Libby. And in both of them, courthouses are surrounded by tents. In both of them, there's heavy competition. In both of them, the BBC calls you all freaking day long asking you to help them. Please, make them stop. And there's a little less breathlessness probably in the business important trial stuff than there is in the other. But there's a vacuum in both of these for the unimportant. There's the interesting and the important. And the unimportant, this is a great example from Enron. I call it Cologne Gate. And in this case, it was in February of '06. And we're all sitting there on our pillows at our spots, of course. And the judge calls, the jury's out, and the judge calls all the lawyers up to the bench. And we can see them all, at one point they all look to the one female lawyer, and then they look back up. We don't know what's going on. And the judge just says to us, well, we had a scheduling problem, there'll be a 5-minute break. So I go up to ask, as does every other journalist there, and they tell us it's sealed. So what do you think? Oh, I don't care anymore? Yeah, right. When something's sealed, that's when you're like frantic to find out. So I asked everybody I could find, and of course, a lot of people hear something at the bench. So anyway, I found out. And here's what it was. One of the jurors was finding someone's cologne so atrocious and disgusting that they were gagging and could no longer keep going. And it turned out to be the cologne of Skilling's lawyer, Dan Petrocelli. By the way, I loved this cologne. I loved it. It was very expensive. This juror had no taste. And really, this thing, I ran down, as soon as I found out, I ran down and did a blog. We called it Odor in the Court. And it began a relationship between me and Kai Risdall and the guys at Marketplace, because if you can make dry business crime funny, you're in. There are all these people who really would like business crime to be funny. And it was funny. And in the paper the next day, I think we called it Law and Odor. And it had legs, in part because Dan couldn't remember the name of his cologne. And he told the USA Today, everybody followed this story. USA Today told them something different than he told me. So the cologne people are calling USA Today and me and saying, which is it? And it turned out to be yet something else. So we ran about stories about the woody, appealing scent of whatever it was. And it had legs, and people loved it. They loved it. It's this real serious stuff, but you can, because of the web, we couldn't have run that much on that in the regular paper, probably. Maybe something this funny we could have. But there was other minutia that people loved. I mentioned to some other people at lunch, this jury bonded. And they started in, I think, like January. On Valentine's Day, most of them were red. On Mardi Gras, they all had beads on. Here's the deal. We're close to New Orleans, but on Mardi Gras Day, we don't wear beads. And the jury all had beads on something apparently called, wait a minute, Texas Independence Day. I am from here. I am from Syracuse, New York. So I didn't know what the hell was going on. Excuse me. The jury wore Western wear, and we all had to go to the NBC affiliate, Phil Archer, and ask what was going on. And it turned out to be Texas Independence Day, and the jury was all wearing Western outfits. 4 months trial. So that kind of stuff, people loved that stuff. This is the stuff you might want. This is the interesting stuff. The internet allowed us to write about it because there was space, and people loved it. people loved it so much that we would run these photo galleries. I mentioned some of the kids earlier. The currency of the internet for us, because we haven't figured out how to make money, is clicks. So we run these photo galleries so people will click 20 times and we get 20 clicks. One of our readers, apparently, again, one of the lonely ones, writes in and says, Ken Lay's wearing the same color shirt every day and the same color tie. And I'm thinking, that can't be. Oh my gosh. So I go and I talk to him. He goes, yeah, I wear a blue shirt every day and a red tie. And his wife goes, he's so easy to buy for. And so, I'm writing about the color of Ken's shirt and tie. Something that, again, without the internet, we might not have had the space to be quite so silly. And other bloggers you'll see coming from trials, writing about, even during Enron, the Wall Street Journal a guy wrote about what he had for lunch, where he liked to go for lunch in Houston. Some of the bloggers from Screw to Libby, they were like Faulknerian in their endless sentences. It was like, you wrote about one of these, it was like they were people who couldn't have it be silent in a room. They just kept writing. And so you see that the internet has allowed people to go from trials and just go on and on and on. And readers get into all of this too. They write at the bottom of blogs and they write at the bottom of stories. I read a story about a guy who sued 1-800-Flowers.com. And he sued them because he bought flowers for his girlfriend on his Visa card. And they sent the bill to the address for his Visa card, which was, of course, his home. Okay? Yeah, you can fill in the, yeah. So what happened is people, again, loved the story. Not important, but interesting. The readers writing at the bottom of that story were having so much fun that at the end they decided to go out for a beer together. And at the bottom of the story that I wrote about 1-800-Flowers, you see these people going, where should we go? When do you get off work? It's just like, it had become eHarmony. That doesn't happen. That didn't happen in the old newspaper. And on live chats, we had, obviously it's with chats with the readers. As far as I could tell, dealing with the guys who read sports, they asked some questions about the law and about steroids and the law, but they also seemed to be mostly trying to get a name that had a phonetic sound for like a piece of horse's anatomy. And most of what we had to do was they'd be screaming, Mary, Mary, don't answer that, because the name would turn out, if you said it, to be something foul. So that didn't happen before the internet either. So anyway, the internet also has changed trials, and the stuff we put on blogs has changed trials. In Enron again, of course, there was a section where Ken Lay was talking about something called an auto pen. And this is where he was charged with bank fraud too. And he had put a signature in a machine that allowed his secretary to use the same machine to sign checks when he wasn't there. Now, Lay wasn't saying, I didn't know she signed it. He was making an argument that he was distant from the document and hadn't really understood his import. But one of the bloggers misunderstood, ran a picture of a giant robot, and wrote, Ken Lay says robot signs for him, or something like that. The next day in court, Lay's lawyers talked to the judge, and this is a trial to the bench, and explained to the judge what they really meant, thinking he might be as silly, I guess, as the blogger. And the blogger had calls the lawyers to change what they did. There's a blog in Fresno. A Fresno TV station was covering, this is a murder case of a chemist accused of, or some kind of scientist accused of killing her husband. I think there was acid involved. Anyway, it was moved. And this is this is one of her blog entries. 2:25 p.m., December 3rd. Peterson asks her if she's been following this case. She says yes. And she says she's been reading my blog, period. That's the whole entry, that particular entry. It turned out in that case that several people came forth as witnesses because they'd been reading her blog. Now, of course, people might have come forth as witnesses because they'd seen it on TV or because they'd seen it in the papers as well. But somehow we're adding a little more import when it comes from the internet. I think it's scaring people a little bit more, and I'll talk about judges being scared from it later. But a lot of litigants have had websites as well, and you've seen Martha Stewart do it, Michael Jackson do it, Ken Lay did it. On it he put up his vitae, he put up his charitable work, and he also put up evidence that he liked. basically, the trial. The Department of Justice wound up responding online, putting up evidence they liked. The clerk's office was going to, oh, I hate the part where you guys start looking at your computers and smiling when I'm not being funny. Up here, please. The clerk's office also was going to put up evidence, but they wound up not having to do that because the two sides were putting up most of everything. And we in the press didn't need much other than what the two sides were putting up. Lay did something else really interesting with the internet, too. You know, when you do a search on Google, this is the international sign for a search on Google. What comes up on the right side are the ads. You've seen it before. You know, there probably is some ordering too, but on the right side there are ads. And those ads, of course, are keyed to what you put in for your search. And what Ken Lay did was, if anyone put in Enron, they got an ad for his site. But also if anyone put in my name, they got an ad for his site. And if they put in the name of Kurt Eichenwald, the New York Times reporter for it, they got an ad for his site. Brilliant. Brilliant, huh? Pretty smart guy. Courts have, of course, used the internet a lot, and you can find rules online. You can find, there's a lot of e-filing online. Oh, another interesting way. This was great. Skilling's lawyers were represented by O'Melveny out of L.A. And, of course, we had readers writing in on our blogs. And one of my cohorts who had a blog, he had an opinion blog, Lawrence Steffi, he started looking to see who was writing in, who was putting little comments. And sure enough, I don't know why the guys at O'Melveny didn't know about Gmail. Lawyers from O'Melveny, lawyers on Skilling's team, were sending in questions and writing comments on our blog. They were sending in questions to my Ask Mary column. So that's another way lawyers can very foolishly use the internet on their cases. I asked Dan Petrocelli why they didn't know about Gmail, and he just didn't respond. Obviously, they didn't expect us to find that. But a lot of what's on the internet, a lot of what's on the blogs, and you know this, is opinion, or it's facts reported by newspapers, surrounded by opinion, or tainted by opinion, or with opinion added to it. It could be that if we lose newspapers, we'll go back to the days of the pamphleteers, where on radio you can hear the left and the right, and you can find a newspaper that'll tell you what you already agree with. Because I think it costs more money, it costs a lot more money, to cover things down the middle, or to at least try to do that. So what has all this done to the judges? I'll tell you, it has them more frightened. The internet, for some reason, when the woman from Fresno writes, she was a TV reporter, by the way, who had this blog and writes that a witness has come forth because of her blog. For some reason, I think that scares judges more. And we've seen a judge in Florida, let me see, I didn't put the year on this. This is fairly recent, though. Oh, I know, this is from the New York Times. This was all very recent. This was in March. A story about, it's not exactly a trend, but some anecdotes. A Florida judge in a drug trial found out that 9 jurors had used the internet to look stuff up and declared a mistrial. Now, we all act like that's news. If the jurors had used, I covered a case once where jurors used a Bible to look something up, and there's a mistrial declared. But it's somehow a little sexier when it's the internet. In Arkansas, also in March, some lawyers asked for a large $12 million judgment to be overturned because a juror had Twittered updates in a civil case. In Pennsylvania, they've asked for a mistrial. They didn't get it in a state senator's case because a juror had used Twitter and Facebook. And again, to me, this is just communication. If the juror had told people just out loud, I'm not sure it would be that different. But it feels different. It feels sexier and wider for some reason. And judges have been nervous about what's up on the net, too. In January 2008, a trial in Florida, there was a gag because of an internet video of a beating, and the beating was the subject of the trial. Gag in Oklahoma, also in 2008. And the judge said one of the reasons for the gag was because of reader comments underneath a story about the trial, which is really scary. Arkansas, in January 2009, a gag because of an interview about the case on the trial. So it's getting in the way, and it's making judges nervous, and that makes me nervous. Largely because When judges close the doors, the only people who usually try to pry them back open are newspapers. Those of you who are law students, do any of you know the names of any cases that are about gag orders or sealing? Any of you know anybody, any chance? Well, they're called, some of them are Richmond newspapers v. Virginia, Gannett newspapers v. DePasquale, Press Enterprise v. Superior Court 1, Press Enterprise v. Superior Court 2. It goes on, and it's newspapers that oppose gag orders. It's newspapers that oppose court closings. It's newspapers that oppose sealings, generally. Every once in a while, it's a TV station or a conglomeration of media. But as the internet causes judges to get more nervous and close more things, and as newspapers die, I worry that there won't be an engine there. There won't be money. There won't be anybody watching to keep our courthouses open. This actually really scares me, you guys. I assume you probably know that it's really the advertising dollar that's causing newspapers to die. It's the fragmentation of the advertising dollar going all over the internet to Craigslist and instead of to us. And that's why we're dying, why our business model isn't working anymore. And it's another reason, a reason we also don't have the money to pay for those lawyers anymore, many times. We did have a lawyer attack a gag order in Houston recently, but it was the most idiotic one I'd ever heard of in my life. You guys probably know that gag orders are largely, they are targeted at keeping the jury pool from being prejudiced against somebody by pretrial publicity. Well, in this case, the judge continued a gag order after the person had pleaded guilty. That meant there wouldn't be a trial, and there wouldn't be a jury, and there was nobody to be prejudiced, and he just continued the gag order anyway. Really made me mad. Anyway, we fought it, and so did the local TV station. I want to quote this guy, Paul Starr. He wrote in the New Republic in a story called, oh, it's so sad, Goodbye to the Age of Newspaper, Hello to a New Era of Corruption. He wrote, more than any other medium, newspapers have been our eyes on the state, our check on private abuses, our civic alarm systems. He also wrote about how we aren't exactly perfect, and we aren't as good as we used to be, but how dangerous it's going to be if newspapers and their news engines go. I think newspapers are going to be gone, but we need to find a way to pay reporters, I think, and to continue having somebody in those courtrooms. I don't know which is the solution. I'm sure many of you have heard. It could be like iTunes. It could be like ASCAP BMI. It could be mini payments. It could be subscription. It could be foundations, nonprofit. It could be a mix of all of these. Jon Stewart has brilliantly suggested that we simply put a highly addictive substance in the ink, and so that every time someone touches it, they want to come back. But he has also said, what was it? What's black and white and red all over? You know the joke, newspapers. And then he said, well, what's black and white and red and over? Yeah, didn't like it that much. Anyway, so in conclusion, the internet has made my job harder, and it's been a lot of fun, and it's probably going to cost me my job, and I hate it when that happens. Got any questions? Yes.
I'm interested in what you have to say about the future of long-form investigative in-depth journalism in the Twitter society, because so many people say, oh, I just need the little news blurb, I just need to know the essence of the story. Well, what gets lost in all of that, and how can we continue the tradition of really deep investigative journalism in our society?
It's mostly been done by the biggest papers. The Dallas Morning News was famous for this, and they've had a newsroom that was generally 3 times the size of ours in Houston. It's a giant newsroom that tends to support it, or a magazine with a lot of money like The New Yorker. And I'm not sure what's going to happen to it. There's also something like, is it the Center for Responsive Politics? What's the name of that group that does some investigative? Public Integrity, I'm sorry. So probably there will be 501c3s doing it. There'll still be the big newspapers like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. I think they'll still exist in some form. They'll probably have some people doing it. There may be some more foundations that do that kind of thing, and it may be dangerously funded by the people who want it done specifically. But I think we will continue. I would expect us to continue to have that done on a national level. I think the danger is our state legislatures being ignored. and corruption growing there, corruption growing in our counties, in our cities, and in our school districts. And obviously, when there's less money looking at everybody, I mean, we look at private business too, and it could be a little scary if we don't have more. People like you need to fight to make sure you get to do this. Yes, sir.
You bring up Paul Starr's article, and one I was going to bring up about how, his legal reporting dies, that, the traditional check that newspapers are, as far as the courts and the government kind of goes away. And obviously I think like big cases will always be covered, but it's first going to start to show up, in the smaller local stuff, and it probably already is. Do you think there'll be some sort of like backlash or some sort of like realization by the community, but like, hey, there's a problem here, that, no one's reporting on this or keeping tabs, and, the courts are kind of getting out of control because no one's watching them?
Well, it would take a sophisticated consumer to know that something's wrong when no one's telling them it's wrong. Which is one of the reasons I really hope your generation knows that without creating something to replace our outdated business model, and without creating something to replace the local and state news gathering, that will be in trouble. I mean, maybe there could be, but you want to get to the point where people are throwing tea in the Boston Harbor. It would be a lot better if there's something a little. Did you say you do want chicken? Okay, I thought Obi wanted to throw tea. And I know there are people doing tea this week, but not in. Yeah, it was a bad example. Good point. Good. You were clearing your throat. I'll keep going. So I don't know that people will notice. I don't know how people will notice. I don't know how people will know when their county commissioner is using the guys in the sheriff's office to clear his lawn of debris. I don't know how people are going to know when a city councilman is giving all the contracts to one of his buddies and the work on the road isn't done as well and they're going to be potholes sooner. I don't know how people are going to know that really bad teachers get to keep their jobs and are getting bonuses because there's somebody corrupt on their on their school board. I don't know how people are going to know that they don't know that if we don't have a couple of people watching. And we are already pulling back, of course. If we lost a third of our staff, we're pulling back, everybody else is pulling back. Dave, I'm counting on you. You're just going to have to do this. Yes, Robbie.
But don't you think that a lot of the people that, if they get, laid off from newspapers or even, aren't there enough people that are just independently blogging and kind of being their watchdogs, and you think that it may not replace the volume of what we have, but at least there's people out there kind of watching what's going on?
The people who are independently blogging, like from home, if they don't have jobs or if they're independently wealthy, then they can go to all these meetings and write about it. But for an investigative reporter to do something in depth, for us to find out about the examples I just gave around the room, which are all real examples, of course, probably in many places, not just in Houston, they're going to have to do an enormous amount of work. And most people who are independently blogging are simply echoing what they read in the paper. They read something about this corruption and they say, isn't it an outrage, and I've heard this too, as opposed to them being the one who goes and gets all the documents and goes through the documents and finds the corruption. The idea of the independent blogger who has enough independent wealth to be able to take the time to find the corruption himself is very attractive, and I hope that that's true. But I think most of the voices you hear and most of the people who blog are blogging based on news that is seeded through newspapers, news that's coming through this 85% that comes from newsrooms and newspaper newsrooms. So I'm not sure that there's an answer there. Todd.
Question about, I'm kind of thinking off the top of my head, but I've been reading that government support for PBS and NPR has just been continually dropping over the years from cuts. Do you think that the government could play a role here in funding, like maybe taxing us, like media tax, and then putting it back in NPR and PBS as a way of...
What a lefty you are. That's adorable. Let's tax the people and have more NPR and PBS.
I'm trying to help you out here.
Yeah.
Help you out.
I like the idea of everybody chipping in. I certainly don't like the idea of it coming through the government. They're the reason we need to be there to check on them, and if they're the ones giving us the paycheck, we might as well just not bother, I would say. Plus, I don't think, there is tea that's going to be happening this week. I don't think people are going to go for that. And I think, the NPR and PBS, didn't they stop getting most government money some time ago? They cut back, cut back quite a bit. I don't think the government can be the answer on making sure we have a watchdog on the government. Reserved?
One of the standing criticisms against mainstream media is that they are too close to power, and so for all the talk about watchdog journalism, it just ain't true. It's been proven over and over that we need true independence. This is the criticism. How can you be on a beat for as long as you've been on various court beats? The federal beat, you haven't been there that long. If you were in criminal courts, you covered the same basic people for a really long time. How can you maintain your independence the next day that you have to go there to ask that person a question? If you've written a negative story, they're not going to be nice to you.
One, if you have basically sort of a mean antisocial underpinning to your personality, it works better. Two, if you find, and this has happened with me over the years, you find you trust a source. There was a point where I trusted the DA in Harris County. So I told my editor, I trust this guy. And if I find out something wrong with him, I'll tell you and somebody else needs to cover it. There was a point with one of the Enron prosecutors, I started to trust the guy. I told the coworker I was working with and told my editor saying, I think I trust this guy, which means somebody needs to backstop me on some things and double check when there might be something going wrong. You can maybe stay on a beat if you can be honest with yourself about that, enough about that. A lot of people in government are sophisticated enough to deal with that kind of criticism, especially elected officials, because they know they're going to still depend on you to be in the paper. But yeah, some people shut you out when you write mean stories. I know there are quite a few judges who got really mad at me and shut me out, and their friends shut me out, and tough. Back then there were 2 newspapers, so the best way to be mean to a reporter was to tell their competition. But there's less and less competition, so that's not working so much for people anymore. We are close to power. There's no question. If you keep covering something, you are close to power. When Nina Totenberg came to Houston, I said, do you get to go hang out with the Supreme Court justices and tell jokes with them and talk off the record? And she said, yeah, of course. And of course she does, to some extent. I don't know if she and Scalia go hunting, but she's certainly been, I use that example for another reason that we're not going to get into, but she's certainly been at social situations that we're off the record with them. Just like anybody is with people who cover the beat. You need to know what your job is, and I'm sure sometimes we do it badly. I'm sure sometimes I've done it badly. And sometimes my judgment has been impaired by liking somebody, trusting somebody, believing the wrong thing. And that criticism is fair, that the mainstream media is too much. And so what we really need is more newspapers and more competition and more people and more real voices, not just voices giving opinion based on what little information we collect. And we need the opposite of what's happening to try to to try to check that. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering what your take is on the quality of things that are happening on Twitter, like the citizen journalism, and where we get information on us, it's like all the crisis communication that was going on in the air freight down into the Hudson and then also in the Netherlands. Is that something that you would pick up as a source of information, or is that competition for you?
It would really depend on whether we pick it up and whether we knew what was going on. I mean, to me, what's happening on Twitter is like a phone call from people at the scene. It's whether you believe this is really happening, whether you believe it's really there. I remember covering a prison riot in Atlanta, which actually oddly looked beautiful from the plane coming down at night. It was the prison was on fire. But standing outside of it, and somebody inside had a radio, and they were speaking in Spanish. It was there were mostly Cuban prisoners in there who didn't belong imprisoned, and it wasn't today, and they just put them away. And there was somebody getting transmissions from in there in Spanish, and people had to decide whether they were going to write it or not. It was somebody with a walkie-talkie or a radio or something. And to me, it's really no different than going to, having somebody come from a scene. You have to decide whether it appears to be real, if it appears to be right. I mean, it's the same kind of decisions, even though it's just a different medium to me. I don't think it's any better or worse than phone calls from people at the scene, or better or worse than, I guess there's no telegraph, wouldn't really work. But, it's another tool. I don't think of as the medium of Twitter as competition. I don't think of a website as competition. I think of, somebody else who's actually reporting as being competition. One of our local bloggers, he's a lawyer, and he actually had a client in Enron, an executive, and he has a blog. And he wrote really anti-government stuff, anti-Department of Justice stuff on his blog. And I heard him speak once, say he was a competitor of ours. And I never thought of this guy as a competitor. I thought of him as a lawyer who had a dog in the fight, who wasn't telling people he had a dog in the fight, who was giving his opinion on this blog. And so I don't know. I mean, to me, that's a medium. Did I answer your question?
Kind of.
Kind of, yeah. That's why I asked, because I thought I kind of maybe skirted around it.
Did your newspaper buy that picture that was released on Twitter? From that guy who was standing at the cave, which was a picture.
I don't know. Sorry, I can't answer that.
There's actually a market for information that goes through.
I know TV often buys stuff. I mean, we might use something if AP did, but I doubt we'd buy it independently. But I don't know. Yes, ma'am. Kate.
Can you talk a little bit more about how your role has changed and if you actually like how your role has changed? Like you said, now you have to talk on a radio show or you have to talk with viewers more or readers more. And how does that make you feel? Is that a good thing in your opinion or is it more?
It's mostly a good thing. People never ask me how I feel. Thank you so much, Kate. No, it's mostly. I mostly think it's a good thing, and I mostly really like it. It's a lot more exhausting. It's also a lot more exhilarating and exciting. The reader part, not so much. Sometimes we get really thoughtful readers, but also I find because we're sort of, how you could write a letter to if your toothpaste comes out the wrong color, you could write a letter to a corporation really mean, and you wouldn't think of there being a human who reads it. Sometimes we get email. I got an email that said, "Can't the Chronicle do better than you?" And I can't remember what I'd written, and I just wrote back and said, I work hard, I've done this, I've done that. And they said, usually if you write back to one of those emails, they go, oh, I didn't even think about it as being a person, I'm sorry, and you usually get an apology. But we will get these off-the-cuff, random insults just emailed to us, and it happens to anybody. If you write about immigration, it happens more than on almost any other topic. People just get so upset about their feelings about immigration, and you didn't write their feelings in your story, that they just send these insults. That makes me feel really annoyed. But otherwise, I like it. I like the explosion of information. I like the variety of information. I even like how entertaining we can be, along with providing the indictment. What I don't like is that we're dying in the meantime. The internet has caused both of these, the yin and yang, to happen. Watching my friends walk out the door was horrible. Knowing that I may be walking out the door sometime too is also horrible. So, mixed feelings, I'd say. Yes, ma'am.
You talked about how you're concerned that the information that's available to journalists won't be available to us with the deaf newspapers and that sort of thing. What do you feel about the opposite? I'm doing my research paper topic on victims' rights and the identification of, say, a rape victim or that sort of thing that usually is protected by the media. But in the vast internet, these names are coming out, this information is coming out that maybe the media would protect. What's your feeling on that?
Well, it's an interesting question because I think the internet is making more information available. Judges on the federal level are considering, or have been considering for some time, closing down plea agreements, which are generally public, and some of them aren't making them public, and they're sealing them. And I've also seen, juvenile records wind up there more often, and even jurors' names in the Tyco case, you saw, well, that may not have been the internet, but in the Tyco case, you saw a long-standing journalistic rule broken by two newspapers by naming a juror because she was interacting with one of the lawyers non-verbally, which sounds very odd. But and I'm coming at this question about the sex victims, knowing that the reason we don't run the names, of course, of rape victims or sexual assault victims is because of the societal stigma, which I think is really something that we shouldn't be perpetuating anyway. So I've got very mixed feelings about this, but I think you're right that there is more of a danger of it coming out. What I'd really like to see is us just stop stigmatizing it. I think it's far less now than when I first started reporting almost 30 years ago. But if the internet could help take the stigma away by making everything public, that would be wonderful. But when you look overseas and look at some other countries where women are just simply killed if someone thinks they've been raped, it does seem like we're a very long way away from that. Did I help answer that question? Okay. Yes, sir.
There is like print media kind of continues to kind of go downhill, and they're kind of letting people go. Where do you feel like legal reporting sits on like the totem pole of priorities at newspapers?
I think salacious criminal case reporting, way up. Government corruption and business financial crime, I think that the really sexy stuff we'll still cover, and some of the important stuff we won't. For instance, in the Enron case, I covered 4 trials, and one of them was a trial of people who were accused of, and some of them have been convicted, some of them have been overturned, accused of stealing money while working in the broadband section. During that trial, which lasted, now I can't remember if it was 3 or 4 months, I wrote 2 stories about people falling asleep in the courtroom, because people were falling asleep in the courtroom, including jurors, including a lawyer, including a reporter for Bloomberg. It was really, really dull. We would never cover that again. We'd never cover stuff like that again. And I think it's really important that we do, not only because it's important if somebody took the money at Enron. It's really important. It was that the government's making a mistake in spending our money to do it. What's really important is the way the federal judge who has a job for life behaves. I mean, those things are important too, and they're really important. And watching all that, watching the way the government prosecutes, and watching the way the judges judge and behave in their courtrooms are important too. And I think we just wouldn't cover a lot of that. We already are letting all sorts of stuff go.
Do you feel like papers still feel that that they need like a dedicated legal reporter, or they can just grab somebody from whatever desk and put them on some big trial, because obviously big important trials are always going to get some sort of
No, I
attention.
don't think they need a legal reporter, and I don't think there are many of us left. And I think there are going to be fewer left. And the lady who was writing the story that we mentioned in the Washington Bar Journal is talking about that. I think it's expendable, especially civil reporters. Criminal cases are more fun, more entertaining. You're going to see more of them on Court TV and on Nancy Grace. So I think we'll still have somebody at the criminal courthouse, but the civil courthouse, we haven't had a reporter there in years already. So I think it is something that's dying. Yes, Kate?
Do you have to fight to cover cases such as the one you just mentioned? Like, do you fight with your editors now and say, no, we need to cover this? Or is it kind of like they tell you what you're covering?
In the old days, it was, in the old days, like 2 months ago, it was probably more where they would ask me what I thought. But now, 1 in 3 of my coworkers are gone. And there's a far higher chance that what I think should be covered won't be paid attention to, especially since I'm a little geeky on this, So I think that reporters will probably lose quite a bit of power as the newsroom gets smaller. I mean, it just makes sense. They have more things that they need to cover, and they're going to have their priorities, and they aren't always going to be mine. That's sad, isn't it? Mark?
In the assigned readings, I think you suggested these. One of the stories was about the partisan sweep of incumbent judges in Houston, Democrats replacing Republicans. What more could, in a time when you're losing resources, is there any hope that we could use the internet to inform voters a lot more about what kinds of incumbents these are, and to give more information using the depth of the web?
If you
we don't have resources.
Well, yeah, I mean, the web is very deep, and the well is deep, but we can only fill it up if you're going to pay somebody to do it, except for, the independent bloggers who aren't paid, or somebody, if you're not paying people to do it, you're not paying people to do it. I mean, there are all sorts of ways of doing it, but, we didn't spend a lot of time on those, and people seldom spend time on local judicial races that are elected in the states where they are, because it's very hard to judge judges, because they can hide behind the judicial code and say, I can't tell you what I do, and so it just gets to be, their resume and a picture of them with their wife and their dog, or their husband and their dog, and so because of that, we spend very little time on that, and less so, I'd say, with this election. Sad, yes, Lindsay?
I know when a lot of papers went online for the first time, for example, the New York Times, they would charge for certain content, like they have the New York Times Select, and I know the Wall Street Journal still charges for certain content. Why have papers moved away from that at a time when they need to bring in more revenue? I know that, readers might demand something like that, but if the newspapers say, listen, you either have to pay for this or we're going out of business, it seems to me that newspapers shouldn't be giving away more for free.
Yeah, it's kind of, we should have done
Why is
that.
that happening?
I think it's the same reason, when I woke up and I heard my words on the radio, and I thought, wow, isn't that cool? When, the internet happened and we got out there, it broadened our strength, broadened our appeal. We heard from people. In the Enron case, those emails I was responding, they were coming from around the world. Not, people who spoke English, thankfully, but they were coming from around the world, not just from Houston or from Texas or from the U.S. And it broadened what we perceived as our power. And perhaps it was our hubris, certainly it was our lack of foresight to give it all away for free, because now you guys expect that. And because the expectations have changed so much, it's going to be hard for us to put in whatever subscription or mini, pay scale or iTunes or whatever we put in. It's going to be a lot harder. But I think in the next months or years, you're going to see quite a few newspapers experimenting with ways to try to make some money off of the internet, because we're not making it with the advertising. We're not making it even close to what we used to do. Obviously, newspapers are losing money now, and some of them have been losing for years. And we've got to figure out a way. And yeah, God, that was really stupid. Allowing scraping was also stupid, I think. Scraping, where you go to Google News and it has the headline of a story that you wrote, and it has the heart of a story that you wrote, and it's there. And we've gotten arrangements. Newspapers have gotten arrangements with Google and Yahoo to share a tiny, tiny percentage of some of that. But basically, by allowing that to happen, we've really hurt ourselves. You saw book publishing and music and Napster and other industries went after Google and people who started stealing from them, but we never did. I think part of it is our view of ourselves. We do think that we're as grand as I've been saying, and we think we're there to try to protect, and we may fail in that mission all the time, but it's what we think we're doing. It's one of the reasons why we go to work every day and accept pay that's lower than what it might be in business. And so I think part of it was our mission and what we thought we were doing, and also just not seeing what was going to happen. When Craigslist came up, we obviously should have started doing classifieds for free and making money some other way. Instead, we just lost an enormous amount of business. When real estate people started putting stuff up, we should have made it come through us. We've lost a lot of innovation being 20th century journalists. Lost a lot of ideas that we could have had, yeah.
Why do you think readers have lost interest in, content-based, reporting, like in terms of knowing what is important to your rights, as opposed to being interested in what Britney Spears is doing or what kind of cologne the prosecutor was wearing? I feel like there's so much more emphasis on that, superficial things, as opposed to things that necessarily make a difference in our rights.
I don't know if they've all lost interest. I think quite a few people your age are very well educated, and I'm surprised that my niece and nephew know as much as they do, and I'm pleased about it. I don't know if they've lost interest, but I think that sometimes you turn to the net and you're looking for something fun. You're not thinking, hey, let's see what's going on with that Korean missile. You think, something more about music or something like that. I'm not sure we've really changed, but the amount of information that's coming to you and the way you can select it may have caused a change in how much time you spend various places. The world used to be really black and white, so it was a lot easier to eat your spinach because that was all that was there.
We have time for one more question.
Joe? Sir?
I was just wondering about the justification for saying that there's a mistrial because someone sent out a message through a service like Twitter. Do judges just not get it? Like, as you put it, it's pretty much just talking out loud of your opinion?
Yeah, and the mistrial, the only mistrial that was declared in those New York Times stories was the jurors looking for information on the internet. The Twitter ones were lawyers asking for mistrials and not getting them. But yeah, I think judges are definitely more afraid of, it's kind of Ted Stevens, the tubes, and just being more afraid of it because it's happening in this way when it's happened forever. Jurors have screwed up and had misconduct for years, but if they're doing it like this, somehow I think it's a little scarier to judges. And maybe because they don't understand it, maybe because they don't know who's reading, and they don't, but they've already picked their jury, And the question is whether the other jurors have read it, not whether anybody else, and yet still people seem to be quite nervous about it. I guess that's it. Thank you all very much.
Let's thank our guests.